Hello there again, friends. I hope you're having a good day. You may have seen the raft of content online aimed at young men about how modernity wants them to be weak. Now, the people making this content are correct. Many of the powers that be would prefer if young men are weak, bovine and slovenly, ideally carrying a bit of weight around the midriff, ideally consuming mindlessly, watching Match of the Day and Love Island, and not putting up much resistance. Again, their right to impart discipline amongst young men. That's a very important characteristic. In fact, Thomas Aquinas put forth the idea that effeminacy wasn't just about behaving like a woman, but actively rejecting one's duty in life, especially in favour of an overindulgence in pleasure. What that means is we become weak within, not just externally. Now, I do think it's exceptionally important to train the body and the mind, but I've also seen that this side of the internet, of the manosphere if you will, can go a bit too far. What I mean here is many of the people that get involved in that world, the hyperdiscipline, the hyper-aggression, I don't feel no pain, that sort of stuff, they end up almost becoming a bit lost and angry themselves too. And I think that may be because they often deny the spiritual, and I can completely appreciate and understand their desire to overcome the darkness of modernity, the weakness of modernity, to find a greater meaning in life, to reawaken and embrace a sense of spiritual vitality that can come with physical challenge, even mental challenge. However, we'd be wise to remember the great teaching in Proverbs that a heart at peace gives life to the body. I think this is especially important as we start maturing. Now, by no means am I saying that we shouldn't test the body here. The point I'm trying to make is when we are challenging modernity and seeking to grow physically, mentally and spiritually, we should be sure that we do so with a sense of deep peace at the very core of us. Why? Because first of all, that's not going to overtax the nervous system. You see a lot of guys embracing the David Goggins thing in this day and age. For those who don't know, David Goggins is an American military man who ended up running, hundreds of miles in a weekly basis, and he does so with broken ankles and so on. Now, in one sense, this guy is admirable, but in another sense, you can see that he's almost running from something. And as tough as he is, I think his book is actually called Can't Hurt Me, ironically enough. You almost think we're going off the deep end a little bit here. Part of being human is acknowledging you can be hurt. That's one of the reasons why we try and get stronger. It's to limit or mitigate the ways in which we can be hurt. It's to be able to defend ourselves and our loved ones all the better, but we must do so in a noble sense. After all, if we become so locked in this mad egoic desire to become infinitely strong or to be invincible, or even to be angry, then what we end up doing is not only harming our own inner world, but often those around us too. We are not exhibiting calm, stable, grounded, earthy, masculine presence. And I think this is what the famous passage in Proverbs is showing us. The heart must be at peace first. Now, I think this is especially important when you're dealing with the challenges of information we get in this day and age. As you will probably well know, I am very critical of modernity myself, but I have noticed in the counter to that, the toxicity of modernity, you do get some people sinking into another excuse for anger, if you like, pointing the finger at the world, not looking at themselves, not turning that finger around and being like, well, where are my own limitations, Where are my own hypocrisies? Am I always completely right in my criticisms, or are they sometimes rooted in my own bias and my own anger? Now, that's a hard question to ask yourself, but if you can ask it, and the reason we should ask it, is one, we'll get closer to the actual truth, but two, we'll be more effective when we're dealing with these things in the first place. I've spoken before about many people who embrace a political idea or a movement online, and they'll come through it a few years later and say, oh, you know what, it was all toxic and angry. And sometimes it is toxic and angry. But a lot of the time, it was their own toxicity and anger finding expression through a niche political or cultural perspective. And this is why we have to be careful of anger. It's why we have to be mindful of the ego. It's why our heart needs to be at peace. So what does peace mean? Well, firstly, peace means without individual bias. because it's the individual bias that leads to the fears and the angers and the wants. You could call it human-centric being, the idea that my mind and my wants are the centre of the universe. That's the great illusion, spiritually speaking. And the great spiritual realization would be something like, true reality is God's being. If you don't like that language, you could just say life. We don't have individual lives, we're all part of life. Life manifesting and experiencing itself. You could view that as something like, we are creations of the divine, having a finite, limited human experience, but our true source is beyond that. Our true source comes from the very centre of consciousness or being. Now, when we sink into this realization, Christ calls it the peace that passes all understanding, we can bring our heart to peace. And the teaching in Proverbs is so interesting because far from that being some weak hippie realization, some new age thing as we might see it in this day and age, Proverbs shows us it gives life to the body. Well, why? Well, I would imagine it's because the stress has disappeared. Very often we're very tight in the modern day. So many challenges and struggles, fears of yesterday, concerns about tomorrow. Well, a heart at peace can overcome these things. It doesn't mean the problems go away, but it does mean you bring peace internally. And that's going to allow you to deal with the challenges of the world all the better. So while indeed modernity does want you weak and we should challenge that weakness, we should also be wary of the counterpole. We should always look for that golden mean, as Aristotle called it. We don't need to go to mad extremes in rebellion to something that we don't like. That's a dangerous path because then we're really only defined by what we're not. The real spiritual journey is becoming what you are, and that's beyond the understanding of the mind. But again, if we can bring our heart to peace, we will give life to the body, which will in turn give life to you. I hope this helps somebody out there. There will be more where this came from down the line. In the meantime, do join the Substack. I'll be looking at starting a monthly group soon. Apart from that, do subscribe if you're new, and enjoy the rest of your day.